Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss an important topic, that is approaches to the interpretation of texts. The main objectives of this lecture are to understand the meaning of texts in political philosophy, to understand the art of interpretation of classical texts, to understand why interpretation of texts is inevitable and necessary, to explore and understand various approaches to interpretation of texts, and lastly, to understand advantages and disadvantages of particular approaches. The term interpretation comes into play whenever we are supposed to discern the meaning of a dream, symbols, pictures, signs, a piece of art, revelations, or written texts in any language. In the broadest sense, however, everything is considered as text, written or unwritten. The shift in interpretation from written to unwritten forms of text is confronted by its own challenges, partly because a written word may have different meanings and understandings. The earliest use of interpretations is said to have sacred origins. One popular strand of hermeneutics has typical religious origins, the need to interpret the meaning of religious scriptures. In this context, scholars have produced exegesis of scriptures such as Bible, Vedas, Buddhist literature, Quran, and so on. In this strand, however, there is an implicit assumption that scriptures may indeed have sacred origins. Frustrated with numerous sects and sectarian violence within a same religion, a group of friends wonder if they could simply stick to the original scripture and follow its most original interpretation. A more fundamental position would eschew the need of having an interpretation at all. If there were indeed such an original interpretation, there wouldn't be any problem in the first place. Problems of interpreting classical texts in political philosophy is fundamentally similar to interpreting religious texts, except for one thing. In the former, we are least interested with the sacred dimensions of texts. This mode of interpretation of political texts is essentially immanent in nature, or simply this worldly. Now we will look into the challenges that arise from various quarters: original language in which a religious scripture are written, intentions of the text, problems of its translation in another language, and so on. Interpretation isn't merely a theoretical exercise, as one may think. It could have unimaginable consequences. Religious fanatics sometimes justify violence on the basis of certain interpretations of religious texts. Similarly, Karl Popper blames misinterpretation of Plato's Republic for modern totalitarian regimes in modern times. For these reasons, Terence Ball calls the very enterprise of interpretations as deadly hermeneutics, primarily because it entails questions of people's lives, liberty, and happiness. For Ball, the need for interpretation is not a matter of choice, but an utter necessity, which is fundamentally connected with the essence of human beings as language-using and meaning-seeking species. Interpretation of texts, therefore, has to begin somewhere around the experiences of human beings, because there is nothing which can be dubbed as problem-free interpretations or neutral interpretations. Does it mean then that interpretation is a futile exercise? Definitely not. Hans Georg Gadamer believes that interpreter has her own sets of prejudices which do affect the interpretation, but they are not hindrances to it. What an interpreter needs to do is to be aware and engage with her own prejudices. What complicates our want of understanding texts is not merely different cultural settings in which they are read and reread, but the remoteness associated with their historical origins. These kinds of texts, which are remote to us in both ways, do not have to be translated only in terms of words, but also in terms of their meanings. The best interpretation and translation, Ball argues, is one which diminishes the strangeness of the text, that is, written in historical period, which is distinctly different from ours. The diversity of approaches to interpretation arises from indispensability of interpretation itself. Broadly speaking, schools of interpretation are categorized into textual and contextual. Yet, there are approaches that fuse the two and offer more nuanced understanding of the texts. In what follows, therefore, we try to briefly introduce and highlight major approaches to interpretations of texts that have occupied prominence over the years. The first approach that we discuss is interpretive or Straussian approach. The positivist fervor of the 19th century dented the very enterprise of the history of ideas and interpretations, and it had to be shown why we must still read the ideas and texts of the long dead thinkers. Leo Strauss was foremost of all who not only rekindled interest in deadening political theory, but also invented a sort of unique ways of interpreting classical texts. Strauss championed the genre of interpretations which is broadly located in the textualist school. Strauss produced a devastating critique of progressivism of John Dewey, associated with the rise of modern liberalism that modern political science viewed as promoting freedom and democracy. Strauss suspected historicism, nihilism, and fanaticism in modern liberalism that began with Hobbes and John Locke, which truncated the normative foundations of political ideals. Political philosophy began to be equated with security, self-interest, rather than political good and knowledge. In other words, it was crisis in political philosophy. If that is so, how can we arrive at genuine knowledge? Strauss suggests that we must go back to classical texts and read and reread them again and again until we discover the hidden truths and meanings within them. But why do philosophers write in a coded language? It is because, unlike the argument that philosophers often have fear of persecution from the ruling class or the public, it is a philosophy that considers philosophical truth to be inimical to political order and stability. It is for this reason that Strauss made a distinction between exoteric texts, which are meant for general public, and esoteric texts, which carries hidden secrets which need to be deciphered. Hence, Strauss's esotericism led to the discovery of a hermeneutic that helps one to understand the hidden secrets of antiquity. It's only through his interpretation of texts that we can cure the ills of the modernity. Strauss soon acquired a cult-like following and has been compared with Hegel's deleterious influence on generation of philosophers after him. As unique as this school may appear, it has serious limitations. Terence Ball sees two fundamental problems with Straussian school. Firstly, his contradistinction between exoteric and esoteric texts is not supported by any evidence. Secondly, it makes a bizarre claim that only the cult followers of Strauss could locate the hidden meanings of the text and conveniently negates the non-Straussian critiques of Straussian interpretation. Now, the second approach, the feminist approach. Feminist philosophers assert that although women have been systematically excluded from the philosophical canon, these texts still contain implicit ideas about womanhood. This assertion involves not only direct discussions about women encompassing their prescribed social roles, capabilities, limitations, and desires, but also subtle suggestions that insinuate women's emotional tendencies, perceived irrationality, and perceived unreliability. This approach enables feminist philosophers to challenge the neutrality of classical texts. They contend that philosophical narratives do not offer a universally applicable viewpoint in areas such as aesthetics, epistemology, morality, or metaphysics. Instead, they tend to favor particular experiences and beliefs. Examining the historical development of the Western philosophical canon reveals a predominant perspective, which tends to represent privileged, wealthy white men. To gain a thorough understanding of the influence of gender biases, it is crucial to re-evaluate this canon and meticulously analyze how philosophers' assumptions about gender are ingrained in their theories. Terence Ball highlights the development of a feminist interpretive method concerning the evolution of feminism as an ideology itself. The feminist approach to the history of ideas has evolved in tandem with the challenging phases of the feminist movement. In the 1960s, feminists primarily focused on examining instances, passages, and specific elements within the writings of historical philosophers who advocated for women's causes. Figures like J.S. Mill, Frederick Engels were hailed as modern prototypes of feminists in this context. However, in subsequent revisions, feminist theorists started to identify supposedly progressive writings as fundamentally dismissive of femininity, portraying the political sphere as exclusively masculine. Philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, Hegel, and others were re-evaluated as having misogynistic tendencies in this revisionist perspective. One noteworthy example in this genre is Carol Pateman's work, The Sexual Contract, written in 1988, which argues that Hobbes' social contract can be seen as essentially a sexual contract involving the surrender of women's freedom to men and the emergence of men as providers of security. Men take on the role of governing the state. A more revolutionary feminist approach to the history of ideas posits that feminine values, once considered irrelevant, apolitical, or problematic for political purposes, are actually essentially productive virtues. Traits like tolerance, previously associated mainly with women, are now viewed as valuable political virtues, with women being seen as more tolerant than men. Women are also perceived as more cooperative, nurturing, and in closer alignment with nature compared to men. Despite the progressive intent of the approach, it is charged with reductionism, particularly for dismissing the whole canon as misogynistic and anti-women. By and large, this approach is universally perceived positively by philosophers. Now, the third approach, the Marxist approach. The Marxist approach to dissecting political theory involves scrutinizing written texts as manifestations of particular historical and material contexts. In classical terms, Karl Marx views politics as a mirror of the economic foundation, emphasizing that one cannot analyze politics in isolation without considering the underlying material conditions that give rise to it. The prevailing class generates ideas and presents them as universally applicable and timeless. These ideas collectively form an ideology designed to legitimize a specific societal structure like capitalism, while discrediting alternative systems such as socialism. In the view of this school of thought, ideology functions to conceal the true nature or alternative possibilities of society. The objective of interpretation within the Marxist approach goes beyond merely understanding a text's argument to answer questions about the ideal state of political life. Instead, Marxian interpretation seeks to situate these arguments in their particular historical contexts, exposing how they frequently pose as eternal and universally valid truths or models, when in truth they advance the interests of a specific social class within a particular society. The Marxist approach to addressing the challenge of interpreting texts involves moving beyond their ideological canopy and revealing the material circumstances of the period in which they were produced. This approach, characterized by critical and skeptical reception of texts, is termed the hermeneutics of suspicion by Paul Ricoeur, which aims to unveil the deceptive aspects of false consciousness. It's worth noting that this perspective is also embraced by psychoanalytic and postmodern methods, although the latter two extend their analysis beyond material factors. C.B. Macpherson's work, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism, serves as an excellent illustration of the application of a Marxist interpretive approach. Macpherson asserted that it is possible to rescue liberalism if it distances itself from capitalism, that is, rooted in the idea of positive individualism, an isolated concept that disregards society. Therefore, liberalism should not be reduced to a mere history of ideas within universal relevance, but should be understood in the context of historical and material circumstances that facilitated its emergence. He also identified Thomas Hobbes and Locke as advocates for capitalism rather than proponents of abstract and timeless notions of rights and liberty. Another variant of neo-Marxism, led by Antonio Gramsci, proposes that the interpretation of texts should not only uncover bourgeois ideology, but also discover socialist counter-hegemonic ideologies in unexpected places and experiences. Notwithstanding the revolutionary potential of Marxist approach, it has been seen quite skeptically by theorists. Terence Ball doubts that if Marx and Engels did not belong to the proletarian class, how were they still able to speak of the interests of the class they did not belong in the first place? Now the fourth approach, the psychoanalytic approach. This approach is inspired by the ideas of Sigmund Freud. The essence of psychoanalytic approach or interpretation involves unraveling how authors perceive and comprehend their world, their inner thoughts, desires, and their relationships with others. Its goal is to bring to limelight and clarify the author's self-perceptions and self-understanding. For instance, Erik Erikson applies psychoanalytic approach in his book Gandhi's Truth on the origins of militant nonviolence to illustrate how Gandhi's unfulfilled desires and early life experiences shaped his identity as a leader. His father's nurturing, premature marriage, and subsequent monastic retreat ultimately took on a political form. Another example is Bruce Maslow's interpretation of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, which is viewed more as a personal autobiography than a political treatise, given Mill's difficult relationship with his father and his inability to marry his beloved Harriet Taylor. However, this approach faces several challenges. It often presents claims that are difficult to test and speculative, and at times it makes unusual assertions and confuses coincidences with causation. Now, the fifth approach, genealogical or postmodern approach. This approach is fundamentally rooted in Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals and has been further developed by postmodern philosophers like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Jacques Lacan, Roland Barthes, and many others. Nietzsche's writings reject the notion of absolute truth within the social sphere. Instead, they advocate for perspectivism, which asserts that an individual's perception and understanding of something are always tied to the interpretive perspectives of those observing it. As a result, there is no absolute truth, only diverse perspectives contingent upon one's subjective viewpoints. With this heightened skepticism, this approach highlights the fragmented and discursive nature of knowledge and calls into question all-encompassing and grand narratives such as liberalism, Marxism, and other rationalistic ideological constructs. It also brings attention to perceived omissions within these grand narratives, oppressive structures, the misuse of power, and limitations placed on freedom. The postmodern approach encompasses various perspectives for interpreting texts. Terence Ball identifies two distinct variants of postmodern interpretive approaches. The first one is associated with the ideas of Nietzsche and Foucault. Specifically, Foucault's writings illustrate the emergence of a modern surveillance society characterized by the disciplining of human society and transformation of individuals into manageable subjects through their own consent rather than coercion. In this context, the postmodern interpretive approach seeks to identify ideas within texts that either endorse or critique such a modern society. The second version of this approach draws inspiration from Jacques Derrida's deconstruction method. Now we move on to discuss the sixth approach, the Cambridge approach or the contextual approach. Cambridge approach arose as a reaction to textual approaches and assumed popularity towards the second half of the 20th century. This approach, also known as contextualism or new history, is associated with Quentin Skinner, John Pocock, John Donne, and Peter Laslett. This approach has diverse aspects, but what is common in them is their critique of the traditional textual approach, which they believed pay insufficient attention to actual historical investigation. Hence, it emphasized the location of texts in their historical contexts, so as to better discern the meaning and understanding of texts. Quentin Skinner has played a pivotal role in shaping this approach through his writings and remains one of its principal advocates. Skinner's contextual methodology entails a thorough examination of texts, emphasizing the need to place textual material within appropriate textual contexts, because relying solely on textual approach is insufficient. Works in the realm of politics are viewed as political actions, and comprehending them necessitates the retrieval of the author's intentions. Skinner proposes that this can be accomplished by scrutinizing linguistic contexts, such as studying other texts written during the same era and addressing the same subject. The practice is crucial for grasping the author's intentions. Skinner also developed what is called the speech act theory, which is originally associated with J.L. Austin, to understand the intended impact of words chosen by the author. Furthermore, this approach entails situating texts within their intellectual surroundings, including political and philosophical contexts. A compelling example of the application of this method can be found in Anthony J. Perel's analysis of Mahatma Gandhi's Hind Swaraj. Contextualism, or the Cambridge School, is by far the most productive of all approaches to the interpretation of texts. This is not only because it offers superior means for achieving a more precise understanding of texts, but also because it cautions interpreters against potential pitfalls that could hinder the interpretive process, such as anachronism, prolapses, and other misconceptions. Contextualism is, however, not always sufficient on its own and may require augmentation through a blend of empirical and philosophical methods. Now we move to the next approach, pluralistic or problem-driven approach. This approach is associated with Terence Ball. This is not an approach proper, but a cumulative application of multiple approaches in the interpretation of texts. Unlike other approaches adopting one position or the other, pluralistic approach acknowledges the inability of any single approach to furnish us holistic understanding and interpretation of texts. Its proponents concede that contexts are crucial for understanding texts, but contend that contexts are varied, both immediate and successive, in which texts are interpreted and received. Authorial intentions are not always important because a particular work can produce unintended consequences. Problem-driven approach, as it is rightly called, shifts attention of interpretation from texts, authors, and contexts towards the problem or set of problems that are being addressed in a particular work. For instance, we might not want to know everything about a certain author, but specific ideas or views of, say, Rousseau or Machiavelli on civic religion. Amartya Sen reads Adam Smith differently. For this reason, this approach is essentially problem-driven, and much of the history of political theory, as per this approach, is a problem-solving activity. There is no doubt that problem-driven approach could offer more nuanced insights on understanding the meaning of texts, rather than being bewildered by numerous possibilities of meanings and interpretations. It urges the interpreter to focus on given problems and issues in the context. The diversity of approaches does not indicate impossibility of interpretation. Instead, it highlights the fact that different approaches provide us with distinct yet vital facets of interpretation. Interpreting classical texts are an inevitable and essential task for theoretical and practical reasons. Nevertheless, it's important to recognize that modern interpretive approaches, unlike the religious texts, are secular in nature. They do not aim to uncover supernatural elements or divine truths, but rather seek to uncover logical, historical, and worldly truths, through rigorous application of methods grounded in logic, consistency, and reasoning. As we have seen from the discussion, each approach has its strengths and weaknesses, and consequently, there is no single ideal approach to interpretation of texts in political philosophy. Each approach teaches us what the interpreter must and must not do to achieve an optimum level of understanding of classical and contemporary texts. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it well. Thank you for watching.